welcome to the Teacher's Toolkit for Literacy, the free podcast for motivated teachers and school leaders who want to inspire their students and school community in literacy learning. Make sure you subscribe to the show on your favourite podcast player, and for more amazing literacy resources, check out the show notes provided with every episode.
Hi, I'm Sharon and I'm the host of A Teacher's Toolkit for Literacy. In every Toolkit episode, we bring you specific resources, tools, strategies, tips, techniques to help you in your job as a teacher of literacy. Firstly, we acknowledge and pay our respects to the Kaurna people, the traditional custodians whose ancestral lands we gather on. We acknowledge the deep feelings of attachment and relationship of the Kaurna people to country, and we respect and value their past, present and ongoing connection to the land and cultural beliefs. And welcome, Phil.
Thanks, Sharon, and welcome back to part 2 of our podcast. Enjoy.
Actually, the other thing is I should mention that Garth secretly told me once about the changes that were coming. He said there had been an OECD report which was pushing for the idea that everybody should be tested, including teachers. And this was the period when the Americans persuaded the world that they should talk about, I'm trying to think of the term. It was about outcomes.
Outcomes, yeah.
The OECD was concerned, and the argument went this way, that the taxpayers were paying a lot of money to educate kids, and they weren't learning to read and write. Therefore, there was something wrong. Therefore, you had to test kids and find out whether they could, and you had to test teachers, and you had to do all kinds of testing. This was bizarre when I was in Massachusetts, where they had a 601 law or something like that said that every kid who had any kind of learning disability had to be tested so that they then could be looked at. The bill for testing the people was so high that they couldn't spend any money on the kids. And my belief is that American education had been totally dominated by the testing industry, by the public issue, and by the publishing industry.
Yep.
And they didn't have any teachers' unions.
So therefore, it's quite hard for them to match what we were doing in South Australia, really, because all their money is going into those things. We just happened to have a period of time where we decided to put it into professional development because it's about the teacher making the choices rather than the materials.
In many ways, we were very lucky and we had a system that was, as I said to the principal, controlled by educators and not controlled by businessmen or bureaucrats.
Yep.
But in America, they were much more democratic. School boards were elected.
Mm-hmm.
In some cases, it was a disaster, as I could talk about in a minute, but I won't for the moment. But that meant that there were some school districts who could do what we were doing in South Australia. In fact, I was utterly inspired by a number of schools where I went, where I sat with the principal on the floor with a group of kids talking about maths. He was a maths guy. And I learned more about maths and was more excited by maths than ever before in my life. And that was part of the whole language movement, which was the publishers hated it because it didn't involve anything more than kids' books and not programs. But it swept America. In fact, I lived for about 6 months going from whole language district to another whole language district, giving talks in those days about writing. And it was very exciting. And I think that's been crushed by the politics of publishing, which requires that schools and spend a lot of money on stuff that probably doesn't have any effect on the kids, but is terrific for the publishers.
Yeah. You could say that education is for sale in some areas or some countries, and rather than it really being about the children.
My guess is that in Finland they don't have some of the things that we have here.
Yeah. Mike, what was it like collaborating with Garth on educational projects or initiatives?
I was fascinated by him. He was an original. He was a legend in his lifetime. I mean, the cliche is useful. When I went to him and asked him about what we wanted to do, he didn't hesitate. He was prepared to make decisions, and he had a clear agenda of what was necessary and what could be done. And I know that other people similarly went with all kinds of harebrained ideas, and he said, okay, give it a try. And he was somebody who was confident enough in his own philosophy, his own ideas and his own experience, humble enough to listen to other people, but very clear about what could be done. But he got it very hard. Towards the end of his career, I think maybe the stress of heading the education department here and the moves for economic rationalism.
Oh, that's the word. That's the words. Yeah.
He, by the way, spoke to me. He might have written to me, I don't know, but I think he spoke to me and he said, watch out. He said the OED has this whole agenda of economic rationalism. Schools have to pay for themselves, they have to be accountable. And that accountability movement, I think, was the beginning of the end of the education cornucopia that we had in the 80s, 90s.
Yeah.
I think Garth called it, we were front-loading the system, which was really important. But the back end, which was the testing part, he saw that coming. He tried to develop an assessment system that was not going to be standardised.
I think that was another issue that was incredibly important and we agreed on. I had waves. First of all, I'm thinking my own career, I was interested in reading and then writing and then assessment. And I think some of the most exciting stuff we did, which was try to find alternative ways of giving parents feedback rather than 74% or C, which was unilluminating. I've got reservations about what we tried to do. I think we tried to do too much. We developed wonderful schemes of having kids being self-evaluating and evaluating each other and getting feedback on their writing and all kinds of things like that. And then kids writing to their parents, telling them what they were doing, and trying to give as much information to parents as they could make. And I think we made a lot of work for teachers. It was all right for the literacy and learning middle years people who'd been through a thorough education program, but for education department then to impose a very complex scheme on teachers who didn't have the foundation for making sense of it, that was a bit much.
Yeah.
And I think next time, if I had a next time, I'd do it differently.
And assessment becomes, when it's a standardised test system, it becomes the tail that wags the dog, really, doesn't it? It's
absolutely. I wanted to change the tail and have an assessment system that actually educated both teachers and parents.
Yeah. How would you describe Garth Boomer's educational philosophy and approach to teaching? I
think his approach, like mine, probably owes a lot to the London School of Education. James Britton was his hero. Halliday, who was professor of linguistics there, who later had a big influence on the genre movement, which was picked up by Fran Christie and others in Victoria. We adopted it to some extent within the Literacy and Learning in Middle Years program. But it was all about child-centeredness. It was all about kids learning and our understanding kids learning and helping them to learn rather than having a bunch of knowledge that we were going to drill into them. Chris Davis, who was, I think, deputy to Garth at Wattle Park Teachers Centre, in her early days, she was one of my first graduate diploma students. That's how powerful we began. She talked about a metaphor of the funnel, that teachers for so long had a whole lot of knowledge that they were pouring into the funnel, which then they'd go into the kids. Now, that wasn't the metaphor that described what Garth was on about. Garth was on about taking kids as they were and helping their natural instincts to learn in a quite structured way. Garth was never on about sort of let's get rid of grammar, let's get rid of spelling, let's get rid of those things, which people claimed. Those people, the right-wing people who were very much, for what they saw as good reasons, as against the whole language movement and what Brian Campbell was doing, they were miscategorising it as throwing the baby out with the bathwater.
Yeah.
And that was certainly not true. I must confess that I had a period when I played down the value of spelling and stuff until I went out to a school where one of my teachers was running a parents' night. And she said, "Oh, we don't worry about spelling here." I thought, gee, God, was that the message she got from me? I think spelling is learned through writing, by the way.
Absolutely. What personal qualities made Garth Boomer an effective and influential educator?
Garth was an amazing person. He was intellectually brilliant. We knew that from when he arrived at Teachers College, and a guy who was a year ahead of me said, "Look, a year behind me," said, there's this young guy coming, he's really smart. And you felt his smartness every time he talked. He was incredibly articulate, and he was knowledgeable and balanced and caring. That's the personal qualities he brought. And he was immensely widely read. I remember being very impressed when one talk he gave, he quoted from Godel and Bach and somebody else, a book written about people who are really top mathematicians and their ideas. I've just been reading about those, and here's a plug. Everybody should read a book called Maniac, which is about mathematicians and the beginnings of computer science, and basically a sort of a brilliant semi-biography of von Neumann, who was the most brilliant person any mathematician had ever met. And Garth was the sort of person who would be in that category.
Nice recommendation. Thank you.
I met a South Australian principal once and I said, "What do you think of Garth Boomer?" And he said, "He reads."
He reads. And I mean, how many principals have time to read?
That's what he said. He said, "We don't have time to read, but Garth Boomer reads."
Yeah,
so
he really does. He was eclectic and balanced.
I think you said, things. He was a thinker. He had original thoughts.
Yeah, I think Garth never went about the business of just taking ideas and reformulating them for the Australian audience. He would take ideas and extend them and develop them and reshape them and feed them back so that people in the US and UK were delighted by Garth and were hugely influenced too. I think they recognised his genius perhaps more than we here in South Australia did.
Because he was often travelling overseas, wasn't he, and speaking overseas.
Yeah.
Yep. How did Garth inspire and mentor his colleagues and students?
I'm thinking of his days at Wattle Park Teachers Centre for a start. They were his colleagues and people, and they loved him and respected him so much and learnt so much from them just by being a decent human being and having sensible ideas about teaching. And the major influence really was through his writing and his conference presentations. He did them all over Australia, and when I say he had a reputation overseas, he certainly did nationally. The people in other states thought we were blessed to have Garth, and we were.
He was a brilliant orator, wasn't he?
Oh, yeah.
And how about he often presented, I don't know, was it one of the Reading Association conferences? I remember him presenting part of his presentation. He sang part of it. Yep. He'd written a song, at which point I thought, there's a completely inspiring way to be thinking about things, not just through one form of presentation, but to make that as song.
Yeah, he would quote literature and he would sing just whatever way he could.
Yeah.
I think you should mention that he was somebody with a background in drama and theatre. He was very interested in dramatic presentation, and he himself, on one occasion, I found to be a brilliant actor. I wrote a review of his performance with Francis Horner in the verse play called The Lady's Not for Burning by, I think, Christopher Fry. And Garth played the lead, and he was brilliant.
Yeah. Mike, what lessons from Garth Boomer's work and philosophy do you think are most relevant for educators today?
It depends on who you are. If you're a teacher educator, if you're a principal, if you're an educational bureaucrat, you really need to read. And you really need to read the literature that deals with the way kids learn, the way kids learn their language, and some of them actually learn literacy without teachers. Not many, but enough for you to say, well, how do those kids do it? The messages are basically the families that the kids who are brought up in literate homes have an enormous head start over kids who don't. My supervisor at Harvard said the best guarantee of becoming literate is to have a mother who's a graduate. And I think that's very true, that educated homes, in terms that Don Holdaway used, prime kids for literacy.
Yep.
Now, the kids who are primed for literacy don't need brilliant teachers. The kids who are not primed for literacy need incredibly capable teachers. And I think governments in recent years have done the right thing, or in my era did the right thing, in picking their most brilliant young potential principals and sending them to disadvantaged schools and giving inordinate amounts of funding to disadvantaged schools. Because let's face it, most kids learn to read whoever their teachers are, and all the hoo-ha about, reading standards are dropping is political nonsense inspired by people who make money out of education. That most kids with ordinary good teachers learn to read. It's the kids who don't that we have to be worried about. And I think, as some people, friends in Victoria, have pointed out, the real crux for the future is kids who get beyond early reading but don't ever end up reading much and don't ever read critically. And that's the middle years stuff that I don't think we ever really addressed as much as I would want now to do.
Yeah, I agree. Seeing what's happening in schools at the moment with a heavy concentration on decoding and phonics and whatever, and not comprehension so much, it's leading to, by the time they get to middle to high school, the kids losing their interest in reading because of that. Probably a concentration on, just saying there's these elements of reading we need to teach, but not realising there's a broad lot of things to teach. And if we were concentrating on just a few things, then those other things are going to miss out. So, and one of those things is comprehension, and kids really understanding what they're reading, then really loving what they read,
Yeah, I think that is a big issue. I spent my graduate work working on comprehension. In fact, when I left Australia, I carried with me, because I was running late, a bunch of graduate diploma papers. This was the very first group. And I'd asked them at the end of their papers to write me a paragraph on what they understood by comprehension. I think there were 13 of them. I stopped in Singapore and lost them and had to go back and find them. And then when I read them on the plane on the way to next stop, I realised that none of them had a clue about comprehension, nor did I. So I spent my graduate years working on that, and I guess what they call it, the major paper that I wrote to get into the doctoral program was on computer models of understanding.
Right.
Because what I was spending my time at Massachusetts Institute of Technology and in Harvard courses, which dealt with cognitive psychologists' attempt to understand understanding and trying to get computers to understand. And computers now do a brilliant job of understanding, I think probably better than most human beings. And I was at the heart of that. And the first artificial intelligence stuff that was happening at MIT, where they invented barcodes and robots and put the man on the moon and all those things. And it was incredibly exciting. But coming back to comprehension, there's no such thing as comprehension in isolation for me. It all depends on what you're reading. I set up a study in which I got passages from non-fiction writing, which were about simple things like the moon and harder things like atomic fission. And I took passages that were written in encyclopedias for children that were dumbed down by taking out any hard words and removing long sentences. They're the measures of readability, by the way.
Yes.
And so you had these marvellously simple sentences, common word things that no kid could understand because they didn't have the conceptual knowledge to make sense of it, the conceptual knowledge in their heads to relate to the text they're reading.
Yep.
Now, this is exactly the problem that kids have, that they don't know enough about what I'm reading about at the moment. It's about computers, actually. Doesn't matter.
Yeah.
They're not going to understand stuff like phlogiston, which was a medieval concept of what was going on, or if it's familiar, they'll understand it. For example, one of my kids was slow to read, but I knew she was okay when she was racing into the paper to look up the scores, softball scores, to see if other teams had won and whether she got a mention. And then she moved on to reading about pop stars. And then later on she got 2 degrees.
Yeah.
But I think the kind of scaffolding that we wanted to do with kids learning to read, we have to scaffold so that kids go through various kinds of genres and various kinds of quite complex content. A guy came to South Australia from one of the universities in Western America, and he had a technique for dealing with secondary kids who'd fallen behind in their studies. And what he'd do is to take them and before they had a lesson on some aspect of science, he would take them and they'd talk about the concepts and the ideas and the words that they used. And then they went off to their class and understood perfectly. Yep. Because they had the conceptual framework, they'd learnt the vocabulary, and they weren't hit by this assault of stuff I don't know anything about. And I thought, that's exactly what we need. We need to lead kids into medical knowledge. We need to lead kids into knowledge about computers. We need to lead kids into knowledge about economics and investing and all kinds of things. And we don't do it. We don't teach them about the real world language. And it's hard. I mean, I find that I'm very interested in economics and economic history. And occasionally I'll read articles by top economists. One of them I read yesterday. He's a Nobel Prize winner in economics. And his whole argument was so crystal clear. I sent it to all my friends and said, this is what economics writing is about. And there's another guy who's a brilliant economic historian who makes everything, complicated things, very simple. Now, one of the problems is that the texts that the kids are asked to read, some of them are awful.
Yeah.
And they shouldn't be asked to read awful ones until they'd read good ones about these things. Yes. I think we could develop a whole technology of learning about comprehending non-fiction material.
Yes.
And that's much more important in my mind for those kids in the middle years or beyond than fiction. Yeah. They've either got fiction or they haven't by their early years. The ones who are quick and good get it.
Yeah.
One of my sons was never interested in fiction. We used to go to the Boston Library, and because there was my wife and I and 4 kids, we would be able to borrow 24 books every time we went. And so we'd buy a whole lot so every kid had a whole lot of books they could read. Yeah. Carl was never interested. He was a whiz kid at school, good at everything. He went off and eventually became a senior vice president of KPMG, gave that up to become CEO of North Melbourne Football Club, where he'd played.
Wow.
Right. He's now CEO of St Kilda Football Club.
Oh, right. Oh.
But it didn't hold him back. And I don't think we should take the view that kids have got to read fiction. Some kids, particularly boys, will be very limited in the kind of fiction they read.
I was going to say, Mike, you know Diane Snowball.
Yes,
she went to a district in New York and they wanted to improve their reading scores, and she said, oh, yeah, I can help you do that. And she got every teacher in the school to read non-fiction to their classes every day, and reading scores went up dramatically. It was increasing their worldview of, they might not have been able to read the text, but the teacher read it to them, and so they were understanding.
And
there was another factor there. The reading tests test non-fiction. You don't get fiction much in reading tests. So she was
Yeah, there you go. She's on the money.
She's a sharp cookie.
Yeah.
She and I got, in recent years, we helped Brian Campbell set up his think tank.
Oh, yes.
Oh, yes.
And
Foundation.
I dropped out because I thought, I'm a fake. I haven't been in schools. I haven't been interested in reading for a long time because after I retired from here, I went as a university administrator to Hong Kong. And then I got involved in research methods, teaching to various business faculties, law faculties, God knows what, and supervising people.
But I think today we've learnt that you're not a fake, Mike, and that there's a whole lot of deep knowledge that you've got that we've learnt from today. Wouldn't you agree, Sharon?
Oh, without a doubt.
Well, I'm very happy to have a chance to talk to somebody about things I care about.
Yeah, and be recorded. Yeah. No, it's just wonderful to capture all this and to see what happened at the start of all this change that happened with Garth Boomer and where it all came from. And I guess is there anything that's from that era that could be applied to today? But I suppose it's a different world, but... Yeah,
I think you've got to confront that different world. And I'd be interested in being connected to a university again because I could envisage, and I vaguely put this to Brian and my American friends, of putting together a program, a bit like literacy and learning middle years, but a teacher development program that really used the resources of universities as a base, even if the people in the universities were only one or two.
Yes.
I mean, the only people from the university and literacy and learning in the middle years were Barbara Coleman and me. But to make any difference, you've got to get to the university people.
Yeah.
And you've got to document what we do. We didn't ever document Limey. There's no written record of that. Nobody knows about it except those people who are in it.
Yes, yeah. For goodness sake.
But it'd have to be something in it for universities, and they like doing research and they like getting status. And it could be in the new university that's just begun,
yes,
an opportunity.
Yeah, I think a Limey type model and it could be an improved model, just to make it even better than it was. It would be a fantastic thing. Yeah. Yep.
I mean, it was the thing that was possible at the time, and it was partly possible at the time we all knew each other. That Garth was a friend, the guy from the education department who agreed to the money said, yeah. When we argued about who would get the percentages of the money from Limey, the university wanted 50%, the education department wanted 50%, Catholics wanted 25%, and so on. And so I had to sort of go around at each of them and say, look, you're not going to get 50%, and it's over my dead body. And the guy in Catholic education, they said, we don't want Mike dead, so we'll agree to 16%. But I think there are totally different models available.
Yeah.
Yes, yeah. And I think that idea of facing what we're in, but facing it and doing something about it.
But you've got to do it collaboratively, I think.
Yes, there isn't a...
And let me just say one last thing. I worked in an offshore Doctor of Business Administration program run by the University of South Australia, originally in Singapore and Hong Kong. And then I taught research methods in this. And I went to Taipei, Bangkok, Singapore, Zurich, and almost all the people involved were not people from the University of South Australia. Other people teaching it and supervising. And finally I nailed the guy from University of South Australia who was in the business faculty. I said, why have you got people like me teaching in this program and why not people from faculty? He said, I wouldn't let those people in the faculty near my students. He was virtually running his own university program, which brought in enormous money, which the Vice-Chancellor loved.
Yes.
But I thought, well, one could do that. There are a lot of people of a similar mind in other states who could have a role in it, particularly with online stuff
Yes.
and Zoom and all those things.
Yes.
My first son is coordinator of the Royal College of General Practitioners around Australia. I said, do you travel a lot? He said, no, we mostly meet Zoom.
I was going to ask you what would be your one wish for education in the future, but you've I guess you've talked about this thing of combining the knowledge of universities and...
I think this is about, I mean, what we desperately need are really good teachers, and I mean carefully selected teachers if you possibly can. I think you have to try not to let into teacher education people who've got the kind of problems that mean they wouldn't operate well with children. But you have to get intellectually able people coming in and people who are prepared to learn and knowing that they'll have to continue learning. And then we have to have really good pre-service programs, not taught by academics, but taught by teachers who've gone on to get academic qualifications and remain reasonably close to schools. We don't want psychologists. We don't want other people. They're not the people who have the knowledge base. But you've got to have a system that virtually the medical profession has, which they're required by federal government to continue ongoing professional development. They've got a fair deal of choice, and that works. If they don't do it, they don't get registration. They don't get Medicare.
Oh, the rebates.
If Medicare keeps the doctors going. If they don't continue to upgrade, they've got a choice. They could go off and be a private doctor and not their patients won't get Medicare.
Yeah, teachers have to do a certain number of hours of PD to keep their registration, but it's pretty free what they can go and do. They could just read. So there needs to be some sort of quality assurance that they're getting something that's going to... But you're right,
Well, I mean, Limey provided a model in the sense that we took stuff to schools. We ran our modules in the various schools. And the teachers who came there and teachers from surrounding schools. And that seemed to me the way to do it. I mean, there were a little bit of inventiveness and a little bit of thinking.
But that was the key to it. That's what made it work. It was how will this work for teachers?
My driving force originally was, look, my daughter who graduated originally in PE was the only one among 60 who got a job in South Australia because there were too many teachers. This is before they cut teacher education back. And I thought, I don't want to work in undergraduate courses. I'm not affecting anybody. The people in the schools are determining what happens. And our graduates anyhow went out and teachers said, forget all that shit you learned at Teachers College. Now this is the real world. So you had to tap, but I thought, well, let's deal with the real world. And but the problem was we were running courses where the only people we saw were people who came after school, and during the day we had external students. I thought, gee, we're getting further and further away. And that Limey was my means of getting back into contact with. I couldn't talk to teachers about what they should do because I hadn't been in schools. But you could. And you did.
Yes, we did. And twice a week we were there.
I think you've got to mobilise the power that exists. And somewhere in the system there are lots of terrific teachers who don't have any connections much with the other good people that go.
Yeah.
Networking is one answer.
Yeah, and I think one of the things we had back in that era was, as you said, a whole layer in the bureaucracy that was teachers rather than bureaucrats. If you had a Garth Boomer up there saying this is what we've got to do because he knows about good teaching and learning, it's a bit different. Do you think that's I
was very proud of the fact that I could say in America that we're a profession run by professionals. Doctors are run by doctors. Architects are run by architects and so on. We're not professional and we won't be professional until we run our own profession.
And then you understand the needs of the profession. Anyway, we'd like to thank you, Mike, today for a fantastic interview and finding out all about Garth Boomer especially. But in finding out about Garth Boomer, we found out about a whole lot of other things, which has been really valuable. And I thought we would finish today with a poem by Garth Boomer himself when he ended a conference in 1990 at the Australian Literacy Educators Association conference in Adelaide. And over to Garth.
I know of no better and more rousing way to end than with the greatest poem I know about possibility. Come, my friends, 'tis not too late to seek a newer world. Push off, and sitting well in order, smite the sounding furrows. For my purpose holds to sail beyond the sunset and the baths of all the western stars until I die. It may be that the gulfs will wash us down. It may be we shall touch the happy isles and see the great Achilles whom we knew. Though much is taken, much abides. And though we are not now that strength which in old days moved earth and heaven, that which we are, we are. One equal temper of heroic hearts, made weak by time and fate, but strong in will, to strive, to seek, to find, and not to yield.
Thank you. And thank you, Sharon. Thank you, Mike. And bye for now, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks for listening to the podcast. To make sure you don't miss any literacy learning tips and insights, please subscribe to our show on your favourite podcast player. At Q Learning, our literacy specialists draw on over 30 years of teaching and international consulting experience to deliver world-class learning solutions. We equip, empower and support teachers to become their authentic selves. To find out about upcoming webinars and about how Q can help you and your school, visit qlearning.com.au. And you can get even more amazing teaching resources right now at teachific.com.au. Stay tuned.